Hi everyone, I'm Giselle Fernandez and I've come here to the University of Arizona at Tucson to speak to one of the most renowned philosophers, intellectuals in the world, as well as leading expert on propaganda, politics, media, war, and of course I'm talking about the renowned Mr. Noam Chomsky. I'm here specifically to talk with him about the refugee crisis on our borders.
Those are the only two options: totally open borders or criminal prosecution for lawbreaking.
I'm here to speak with him about the state of our democracy. Are we in a constitutional crisis? There's no one better to address these issues in a really meaningful and thoughtful way than Noam Chomsky. Thank you, Mr. Chomsky, for sitting down with me. I consider it a real honor and a privilege to be able to discuss these matters of such urgency with you, so thank you.
Happy to be with you.
Thank you. You have been a leading voice on the refugee crisis, not just from Central and South America, but all over the world for decades. But this moment in time, with the thousands of families from Central America at our gates and being separated by the zero-tolerance policy, the children jailed, seems a very different moment, particularly for the United States and its values and ideals, or our perceived values and ideals, and how we define ourselves. How dangerous is this moment in your estimation, and what does it mean for the United States?
Well, I think we should really regard the so-called refugee crisis as a deep moral crisis in the West. I mean, tens of hundreds of thousands of people, it's going to be many more in the future, are fleeing from intolerable conditions, from violence, terror, starvation. They're of course fleeing to the places which have wealth and resources, and which furthermore have a major responsibility for their plight. In the case of Central America, the United States has a shocking record of support for murder, violence, slaughter, virtual genocide. The 1980s, we devastated the three countries that are now the main source of refugees. The fourth, Nicaragua, was unusual in that it had an army to protect itself, protect the population from the US-backed terrorists. In the other three countries, the terrorists were the army. And now the end result of this, people are fleeing from the wreckage that we created. People fled, and young people fled in the 80s, came to the United States, to Southern California, other places, that were caught up in gangs, going back, and the gangs are devastating the country still further. Quite apart from our crucial responsibility, just out of plain elementary moral considerations, we should be welcoming these people. But given our role in their devastation of their lands, we have an enormous greater responsibility. Actually, we should bear in mind that these people would prefer to be in their own countries. They're not coming here because they didn't like their countries. Since we made their countries unlivable, our primary responsibility is to provide ways in which the countries can become viable. In that case, there won't be a refugee crisis. Right now, there's a moral crisis because of our double refusal. First of all, to absorb the victims. Secondly, to reconstitute what we've destroyed. And similar comments apply to Europe. People are fleeing from Africa to Europe, not from Europe to Africa. And there's hundreds of years of reasons for that, which we all know or should know.
So this seems, yes, a moral crisis, and I would like to discuss that with you, but at the immediate, it's also a constitutional crisis, because these refugees, when fleeing peril, persecution, violence, have a constitutional right to present themselves legally and apply for asylum. Instead, they're being separated from their children and jailed. So does this finally constitute the constitutional crisis? Will this refugee kind of playbook to rally up the Trump base backfire on him, as we've seen it a little bit? Or will it be, as some analysts say, yeah, he may lose the moment, but he's going to eventually win the war, against immigrants?
Well, the recent last few weeks treatment of children, separating them from their parents, they'll never see them again. They're scattered in places where they don't know where they are.
Do you think they'll not see them again? They will not be reunited?
I think it's very unlikely, considering the present circumstances. But this has been such a scandal that it's led to, it compelled the administration to try to backtrack somewhat, because it's just beyond description to see these children torn away, separated from their parents at back. The children are basically lost. The solution that's been proposed is maybe marginally better than the original crime, but only marginally. Essentially being caged. These people, all of them, should have the opportunity to present themselves for asylum according to recognized international conventions, to have legal aid, support, honest courts, not the kind of courts that exist which are simply a scandal, where refugees have an appointed lawyer who tells them to answer yes to whatever the judge says, which they don't understand because they don't know English. So essentially they're saying, are you guilty of coming across the border? And they say yes, and then they're sent back. That's not a legal proceeding.
Jeff Sessions has now said that using gang violence as a reason to flee is no longer justifiable. And the Trump administration is now saying there should be no courts, no judges to interfere, and that these people should just be deported. In fact, there's a deal being made offered to the jailed immigrants that if you want to have your children back, you have to agree to immediate deportation. I mean, in the broader sense, you have been a leading voice against the abuses of our U.S. government. Is this another level, Mr. Chomsky? How would you define the moment?
It's another. I mean, it's hard to evaluate crimes. So take, say, there happens to be a flood of refugees from the Mayan areas of Guatemala to the United States. These are areas where virtual genocide was carried out in the early 1980s with enthusiastic U.S. support. President Reagan praised the main perpetrator of the genocidal acts. Later, many years, he was condemned. He told us he's a wonderful man, a great believer in democracy. We kept providing aid and support. We enlisted other countries to arm and train the murderers when Congress imposed certain constraints on the U.S. Is that better or worse? And now people are fleeing. How do you compare that with taking children away from their parents and sending them off to oblivion? I don't know a metric that compares these crimes. They're all horrendous.
So what do we do? In your Instagram, there's a wonderful quote. I'm not sure if it's yours or someone else's. I think it's yours, where you said, that apathy basically is complicit in the crimes. If we do nothing, but we feel so unempowered, we feel so victimized by the media and the propaganda, that what do? He's hijacked both parties.
Well, the fact is, with all the flaws of the United States, it remains a pretty free country, which means we have plenty of opportunities to do things.
So you remain hopeful?
I think we should always remember Gramsci's famous slogan that we should have pessimism of the intellect, but optimism of the will, meaning, which is particularly important for people like us who do have opportunity. And opportunity confers responsibility, which means we can make use of the opportunities that are available to us, and they range from legal measures like providing legal aid to charitable acts, to electoral politics, to civil disobedience. We have a wide range of things we can do to try to overcome shocking, sadistic violations of elementary human rights.
On the news the other day, there was an analyst who said, you should stop being shocked and astonished by the daily, assaults of this administration and the autocracy that's now out in the open, framed as a democracy. Yet, in all of your writings, you've spoken about these abuses for years. This is nothing new. It's just more out in the open and blatant. Would you assess this on a scale of 1 to 10 as the worst you've ever seen it?
No, I don't think so.
Where does it fall?
How do you compare it with killing several million people in Indochina and destroying 3 countries? Every sadistic horror has its own particular disgraceful characteristics, and you can't really weigh them in scales. They're all horrible in their own ways. We have a lot to think about and do something about. First of all, we can compensate to some extent for atrocities that we've carried out, but we can certainly take care of the victims with mercy and humanity, and in this case, even in accord with international conventions that are well accepted, violated constantly, but nevertheless formally accepted. We should be taking the lead in accepting them. After all, the United States is the richest, most powerful country in world history. We have incomparable advantages. We have huge territories that are unsettled, plenty of ways of bringing in these miserable people, for many of whom we are responsible for their fate, and arranging for them to have decent, productive lives contributing to the society. We should think about, there are countries that are accepting huge numbers of refugees. So take, say, Lebanon, which is not responsible for the plight of the people who fled there. About almost half the population are refugees. Kenya has huge numbers of refugees. Bangladesh, extremely poor country, has been taking in tens of thousands of refugees.
So then why does America, and certainly we're seeing it more in Europe, but why does America have this, and even in the Latin communities who said, no, don't come here, why is there such a sense of we're a country of immigrants who hate foreigners? Why are we not saying we must bear this responsibility, and if not for children, who? What has happened to us that we're closing our doors?
Well, first of all, it's not the first time. Immigration, we are a nation of immigrants. Immigrants were brought on very willingly, not for pretty reasons, because it was necessary to settle the areas from which we were expelling, in fact exterminating, the many nations who we destroyed when we set up this country. Worth remembering that the United States is a settler colonial society. It's been at war almost constantly since its founding. First, the wars against the numerous Indian nations who lived here. They were effectively exterminated virtually. Then foreign wars, many in the Central America, Caribbean region, and then beyond. It's hard to find a day when the United States has not been at war, and these are not wars of defense. So immigrants were brought on as long as they were white. And in fact, very precise distinctions were made. So Benjamin Franklin, who's among the founders, the leading figure of the Enlightenment, he argued that we shouldn't admit Germans and Swedes because they're too swarthy. It's a good indication of what these things mean. Finally, white immigrants were admitted, often treated with extreme harshness and brutality, like the Irish, what were called the Huns from Eastern Europe. Finally, by the time of about the First World War, The country was pretty largely settled, though not densely by the standards of the rest of the world. And the first Orientals were excluded entirely, but from the late 1880s. 1924, the first really harsh immigration law was passed to block, they didn't say it, but basically to block Italians and Jews. The way it was said was, it was a National Origins Act, which was designed so that Southern Europeans, mainly Italians, and Jews from Eastern Europe would be blocked. That remained until the 1960s. One of the consequences of that was that millions of Jews were sent to extermination camps. My whole family, for example, because they couldn't get into the one country in the world that could easily absorb them. There's horrible stories from the late 30s and the early 1940s about
the USS Stewart, when we turned back, when Roosevelt turned back.
Turning them back and sending them off to a fate that we know about. That lasted until the 1960s. So what's happening is not new. It has its own unique ugliness, but as I say, a savagery of different kinds is not comparable. You can't weigh it. So there's a long history of, and this is against a background of extreme white supremacy. In comparative studies like George Frederickson's of white supremacy, the United States ranks the highest in the world, even beyond apartheid South Africa. These are very deeply rooted social pathologies in the
So
United
this
States.
is not Trump igniting this. It's unleashed what was always there and a white lash of what happened with Obama.
Well, I think Trump has quite consciously taken the cork out of the bottle. The things that were latent are now not only accepted but applauded. And social pathologies that have been there and showing in awful ways throughout the centuries are now becoming tolerable. There's other factors, both here and in Europe. The same thing's happening in Europe.
Wealth inequity?
What's happening just today, in fact, Italy again turned back a ship full of migrants fleeing from Libya, where incidentally Italy carried out literal genocide about a century ago. There's a history there that's not so pretty. Of eastern Libya, the Cyrenaic, maybe half the population or so was wiped out by Italian slaughters. Later Ethiopia and other places, they're not they don't have clean hands in this case. And the same is true for the rest of Europe. And could go through the history, but it should be well known. It's horrendous. But I think we should bear in mind that there are other reasons why these social pathologies, which is what they are, racism, xenophobia, white supremacy, why they're surfacing in this particular moment. We have been through a period of about 40 years of a socioeconomic experiment. It's usually called neoliberalism, meaning business first, everyone else last. Took off under Reagan, Thatcher, and it's had effects. One effect is that for the large majority of the population, it has led to stagnation or decline. Real wages for male workers are about what they were in the 1960s. Productivity has increased, not as fast as before, but it has increased. Wages have not kept up with it. In fact, they've stayed steady, meaning the results of the productivity go to very few pockets. There's an enormous concentration of wealth and very few hands. That concentration of wealth almost automatically leads to concentration of political power by perfectly obvious means. So the government becomes much less responsive to popular needs. Something similar has happened in Europe, and they call it austerity, but it's the same thing. The effect of all of this is to create anger, fear, disillusionment, contempt for institutions, You take a look at election after election, the centrist political institutions, parties, others that have been pretty much running the countries are completely falling apart. In conditions like this, in conditions of anger, despair, there is an opening for pathological elements that are latent to surface.
Well, that's what's happened here. And as a linguistics expert and pioneer and propaganda expert, do you think Trump is consciously, strategically masterminding, what's happening? He has Mein Kampf at his bedside, according to a Vanity Fair article. Or is this just him being, a wizard at ratings, television tactics?
We have to speculate about a person's thoughts, but just looking at the evidence, the impression that's created is that he has a very simple ideology. It can be expressed in 2 letters, me. The only thing that matters is me. Now that has corollaries. It means you have to keep your base loyal, in fact by now worshipful. He's a canny politician. He knows what appeals to them. And in moments of periods like this, periods of anger, fear, and distress, what's going to appeal to people is playing to their fears: xenophobia, white supremacy, misogyny, racism. And he's doing that very well. Incidentally, this is only half the story. The other half, which he certainly understands, is that he's providing cover for the most savage wing of the Republican Party to step by step dismantle any part of the government that's for the benefit of the population, and to concentrate all wealth and power in their actual constituency, which is extreme wealth and corporate power. You see this in step after step.
So do you think you've talked about the doomsday clock being 2 minutes to midnight. What about unrest and civil war in our own country? There are analysts this morning talking about we're closer than ever to just an uprising of massive proportions because of those that don't have and finally fed up. Are we close to a civil war?
I don't think so. The country's, despite everything, the country's still an organized, advanced society. It has awful features, but I don't think there are armed militias running around, but I don't think we're in a stage of civil war.
But when we are fractured like this, does it make us more vulnerable to foreign attack? And then does it also make us more vulnerable to our own civil war?
The United States is the most secure country in the world, in history, in fact. It's one of the most frightened countries in the world, but it has always had enormous security. I mean, just take a look at American history. The last time that the United States was attacked was 1812. Could any other country say that? The United States controls the hemisphere, controls both oceans, controls the opposite sides of both oceans. There are conflicts, but they're on somebody else's border.
But you've said, though, that you think this is probably the most dangerous time you've seen in a very long time.
It is for other
and
reasons.
That Trump, climate change and our lack of addressing it, and also
now you're
nuclear
getting
war.
to the serious issues.
That all this is a distraction. We're talking about all these other things when those are the main issues that barely make headlines.
Well, we are, now we're getting to what really matters. All of this is horrible and significant, but minor in comparison with a question that is now being posed to the human species for the first time in its couple of 100,000 years of history. Namely, are we going to survive? And that's a very serious question. Since the nuclear age, late 1940s, there's been a very ominous shadow. Anyone who's looked at the record can only conclude that it's literally a miracle that we've survived this far. There's case after case when, either by accident or by reckless acts of leaders, that we've come very close to terminal destruction. Turns out, wasn't known in the late 40s, that not only was that the beginning of the nuclear age, but it was the beginning of a new geological epoch. It's called the Anthropocene, the geological epoch in which human activity is having extremely harmful, destructive effects on the general environment. It was happening before, but it began to escalate in the late 1940s. In fact, the World Geological Society has fixed in the late 40s as the onset of this new geological epoch. And by now, it's extremely serious.
Do you think that has anything to do with the volcano eruptions in Hawaii and in Guatemala, or the tsunamis, or is that just completely disparate?
It's very hard to pin particular events on the general developments that are happening, but there's no questions about the tendencies. They're severe.
But when the United States, the leader of the free world, pulling out of the Paris Accords, and you've said accelerating, not just, not doing anything about it, actually accelerating the problems, bringing back coal.
In my view, one of the two most astounding events in history. The fact that the most powerful, wealthiest country in world history is not only refusing to participate alone, uniquely, refusing to participate in efforts to deal in some way with the mounting catastrophe, but yes, in fact, is accelerating the race to destruction. It's doing everything possible to make it worse. That's one. The second most astounding thing is we're not talking about it. This is just shocking. This should be a screaming headline in the newspapers every day. What we're facing in the near future, very likely simply sea level rise of several feet or maybe several meters by the end of the century. Just imagine what happens if the sea rises, say, 5 or 6 feet. The consequences will be utterly devastating. I mean, they're almost unimaginable. Maybe the rich countries will be able to handle it somehow, but for most of the world, it's a total catastrophe.
The melting Arctic. The melting Arctic.
The melting Arctic, the melting Antarctic, the rise in temperature, which is itself creating the feedback effect. This is it's simply astonishing.
But when you have corporations owning half the world that benefit by not stopping it, how do you combat that? You said at the beginning of this interview that the refugee crisis is really a moral crisis. How do you awaken, and this is really at the heart of your expertise, how do you awaken a populace to care that those children are not just those children or brown children or criminals or MS-13, or care that, our species is endangered, when all these authoritative forces are telling you it's a lie, it's fake news, it's not real? How do you awaken a populace to care and do something about it?
It's a real problem. We should recognize the scale of the problem. So there's a recent study of voters' attitudes on this. Among Republicans, about half deny that what's happening is happening. Simply say there's no global warming. That's half of Republicans. Of the other half, barely half, a little over half, say maybe humans have something to do with it. I don't think there's anything like this anywhere in the world, outside of places where never, some peasant community where they never heard of it. This is unique and horrendous. So what do you do about it? You work harder.
But wait a second, the Democrats, you have said both parties are complicit in all this madness,
Absolutely.
but the Democrats fail miserably in messaging. They don't have a platform. We don't have a candidate. The only kind of message we seem to have right now is anti-Trump, which all the political analysts say does not work and will not work. So
not only does it not work, it diverts attention to what's important, like take the question of whether the Russians played some role in manipulating the election. I mean, it is such marginal significance, you can barely find it with a telescope. In fact, it's ludicrous, because there is massive interference with our elections, namely corporate funding. It's overwhelming.
do you think that investigation will lead to Trump's undoing?
I think that here I pretty much agree with Trump. I think that investigation is just a waste of time and energy. Even if the worst charges turn out to be correct, they will barely weigh in the balance against the real crimes of the administration. Like, for example, driving the world, not just the country, towards terminal disaster because of climate change. How do you measure anything against that? The idea that, in fact, the Democrats are concentrated on revenge for the fact that they ran a rotten campaign and lost an election they should have easily won. That's not a policy. They're not focusing on the real needs of people and the real needs of the world. And part of the reason is they're complicit in these policies.
Was Barack Obama complicit in those policies?
Well, he made some moves which were positive, but nothing anywhere near what should have been done. You can claim that there were too many impediments from Congress and so on, and it's not just the political leadership. Take the press coverage. Take a look. There's article after article appearing mostly in the business press about the great prospects for the United States to become energy independent by increasing production of fossil fuels. We are now surpassing Saudi Arabia in destroying the planet. Article after article. I've gone through thousands of them. You can't find one phrase saying that, oh, this is wonderful, but we're destroying the world. That just doesn't matter. All that matters is more profit, more power, the idea that we're racing to destruction, and this is accelerating it, isn't even mentioned. So it's not just talking to, Republicans who deny climate change. We're talking about our own circles, educated, liberal people who sort of know it, but meanwhile are diverting attention to marginalia and actually celebrating the monstrous atrocities that we're carrying out against future generations, not far at the distance. We're talking about this century.
Just doesn't seem like we didn't learn from the Holocaust. We had Rwanda, Darfur. We're not learning now.
This goes way beyond the Holocaust. We're talking about the end of organized human life.
So what do the Democrats have to do to get on message?
Well, it's not what they have to do. It's what we have to do to create popular movements which compel attention and action on these issues. The party managers are not going to do anything.
So it's the youth, potentially. We saw what happened with the school shootings. The youth rose up for a moment, and yet the NRA and Congress still batted them down.
That means you have to work harder.
And
it's not the youth, it's people like us who are in a position to do something about it. All of our educated liberal friends should be devoting themselves to this.
But they don't.
And we have to get them to do it. That's like saying people in Germany under the Nazis didn't do anything, so what do you do about it? Try to get them to do something.
The other great threat you talk about, and we've talked about the doomsday clock, 2 minutes to midnight, is the threat of nuclear annihilation and proliferation. Has your mind changed on this at all with President Trump meeting with Kim Jong-un?
Yeah, Kim. Well, actually, that's one of the positive things he did. But we should be careful to see exactly what's happening. The two Koreas, North and South, had a remarkable meeting in which they produced a historic declaration, April 27th. And it's worth reading carefully. It's the first time they have ever agreed peacefully to work towards improving relations, peaceful settlement, denuclearization, and gave detailed proposals as to how to proceed stage by stage. But there's a framework. They said we intend for the two Koreas to work towards this goal on their own accord. On their own accord. and the rest of it is an implicit message to the world, which means the United States don't disrupt it. To Trump's credit, he has not disrupted it. His threats and so on had nothing to do with it. His diplomacy, to the extent that it exists, have nothing to do with it. If he wants to take credit for it, fine, nobody cares. But the one good thing he did is what he didn't do, namely disrupt it. It's happened before. There have been agreements before. The press is simply falsifying the record. The constant picture is you can't trust the North Koreans, they back off, true. But commonly when they've backed off, it's after we disrupted the agreement. And we should make clear that that was the case. Now, again, to Trump's credit, he has, for the first time, not totally the first time, but practically the first time, not disrupted it yet. And we should keep his feet to the fire on that. So that's to the good. We should let the two Koreas proceed on their own accord, as they're planning to do, to overcome one of the world's really serious problems, and give whatever assistance we can for them to do it. But it's not up to us.
Do you think the disruption of the Iran deal leads us closer to war?
It very well might. First of all, I think that again follows from the principle of me. One of the corollaries of that is that if Obama did it, I have to do the opposite. Otherwise, I can't be in the limelight. I can't seem like I'm terribly important. I can't energize my base and so on. That was another scandalous act. That deal was working very well. Even the U.S. intelligence concedes that Iran was living up to it. Incidentally, not discussed is the fact that we were not living up to it under Obama and Trump. We were constantly acting to disrupt Iran's commercial activities, its financial activities. We blocked many of them. That's contrary to the explicit wording of the agreement. But our violations of it don't matter. We're a special country. But breaking it was very destructive. If the Iranians react, as actually they're entitled to do, by returning to developing nuclear programs, that may be used by Israel and the United States as a pretext for military action. And that could blow up the region. The region is disruptive enough anyway.
Right.
Actually, there's more to say about this. There is a much more far-reaching solution that's possible, namely establish a nuclear weapons-free zone in the region.
You've spoken a lot about this. Why doesn't it get any traction?
It did, everywhere in the world except one country, here.
Why?
We've blocked it.
Because
Why?
of corporate interests?
No, because you have to protect Israel's nuclear programs from inspection. There's no objection to setting this up. Iran has been in the lead in calling for it. The Arab states have actually initiated the program, and several of them have threatened to pull out of the Non-Proliferation Treaty and wish to proceed. The rest of the world is in favor of it. It comes up regularly at the review meetings of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. U.S. vetoes it. Last time under Obama in 2015. Everybody knows the reason. You have to protect Israel's nuclear weapons programs, and you have to protect Israel's hegemonic role in the region. I should add, I've mentioned before, that the United States has a specific, unique responsibility to proceed with this. When the U.S. invaded Iraq, there was a search for some legal pretext for what was obviously a straight act of aggression. And what the U.S. and Britain did was appeal to a Security Council resolution back in the 1990s, which called on Iraq to end its, as it turns out, non-existent nuclear programs. And if you read that agreement, it committed the signers, and we were the initiators of the agreement, committed them to work for a nuclear weapons-free zone in the region. Now that, again, if we had media that were concerned with informing the public. That should be headline too. We have a commitment to do what the entire world, except for the United States and Israel, wants to happen. It would settle the problem. Nuclear weapons-free zone with inspection means you don't need a nuclear deal with Iran. You don't have to worry about it. We're blocking it.
That's the third headline we're missing.
It's another one that we're missing.
Do you see this great ideal that so many Americans have had of who we are, and many across the globe, of this humanitarian nation with all these values and ideals, bring us your poor and huddled masses? Do you think this finally erodes that?
Well, there is.
Are we seeing differently around the world?
There is information about this, namely, ask what the world feels like. Actually, it's been done once. Gallup polls do studies of international opinion regularly. 1 year, 2013, they asked the question, which country is the greatest threat to world peace? The United States was in the lead with no competitors. Way behind, in second place, was Pakistan. It's probably inflated by the Indian vote. Iran, North Korea, others were not even mentioned. That's the last time they asked the question. Well, you may ask why. If you look at the coverage, almost no coverage. I think one Murdoch tabloid covered it, and the story was, look how crazy the world is. But for the rest, we don't care. We say we're the most important humanitarian, peaceful, loving power. If the world says the opposite, the world is crazy. We don't have to listen to that.
On the cover of Der Spiegel this morning, there is a picture apparently of Trump with Putin and Kim and the leader of Turkey, Erdogan. And it apparently says, autocracy, Do you see our democracy heading toward like a real, what Germany was in '38 and all of a sudden became, this tyrannical regime?
I think the circumstances are very different. I mean, you can find similarities. So, for example, when I listen to the worshipful crowds roaring their approval of Trump, I have to say it does bring up childhood memories of when I was 6 years old, listening to the radio and listening to the Hitler's Nuremberg rallies. I didn't understand the words, but there was no mistaking the mood, and it's similar. Nevertheless, the circumstances are radically different. I don't think comparisons to Weimar Germany are really appropriate. It could become much worse, but it's very much under our control, and terrible things are happening, but not like that.
Do you think we'll lose the midterms, or the midterms will have a wave of blue that could shift things, or not so much?
If the Democrats could get their act together, they could retake Congress, do much better at the state level. Should remember that the party was practically destroyed during the Obama years.
The DNC kept us from Bernie Sanders.
Well, the state level legislatures just collapsed. Now, there's a significant schism within the Democratic Party between the New Democrat, donor-oriented party managers and the popular base, which is becoming social democratic and shifting. The Sanders vote was an astonishing example of that.
Do you still think he's viable now?
I think it's very viable, but they're going to have to overcome this very significant gap and put forth programs that are meaningful to the general population, not side issues like whether Russia tried to manipulate the elections undetectably. Real issues, what people care about and are concerned about, and what they ought to be concerned about, but aren't, like destruction of the possibility for organized human life. Those issues should be front and center. And if that were the case, I think they could sweep the elections, but that's not happening.
Mr. Chomsky, our time is up, and I so appreciate you spending the time with me. I consider it a real privilege and an honor. Thank you.
Thank you.